Okay.
Good morning. My name is Jim Lanese from Cleveland State University and assisting with the National Park Service project here today. Today is March 9th, 2011, and I'm interviewing Helyn Fiedler Toth for the Cuyahoga Valley Agricultural Project. For the record, Helyn, would you please state your name and spell it, and also please tell us a little something about yourself, when and where you were born, and where you live now.
Well, my name is Helyn Toth, and it's Helyn. My middle name is May, and I was a Fiedler, Fiedler, before I married Ernest Toth, Toth. I was born in Everett in what is now known as the Hunt Farm. This was back in 1920. And we farmed there for a while, and then I married a Cleveland man and moved to the Cleveland area, and I now live in Seven Hills, Ohio.
And if you would, think back to your childhood and tell us, if you will, about your early days in Everett and on your family farm there. How did your parents arrive there? Give us a little bit of family background in that regard.
Well, Everett has been the location of my great-great-grandparents, my great-grandparents, and my grandparents, and my mother and father were married after my dad came home from World War I, and they moved into the house in 1919 on Bolanz Road, and I was born in that particular house in 1920. Anything else?
And are you an only child, or is
Oh, I have a
tell us
younger
about your
brother. He's 5 years younger, and he was born in the house too.
And at the time, was your dad and mom, were they farming exclusively, or tell us about your home and the farm that it occupied?
My family predominantly had come from farming backgrounds, and my parents started farming, and it was mostly like truck farming, mostly vegetables. But I think as time went on, we started doing more because of the Depression. The Depression changed everybody's lives, and we started really farming enough so that we were able to sell vegetables to other people, including some of the stores.
Now, if you would, go back to truck farming. What is meant by truck farming?
Well, I have my own interpretation of truck farming. We farmed for mostly vegetables and did just acres and acres of sweet corn and melons and watermelon and other vegetables. But by going into the truck farming, it meant that we were selling to other people who were reselling. And also, we also had our own little stand out in front.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned that your family lineage in Everett went all the way back to your great-grandfather. Did he immigrate here right to this area, or tell us a little bit about how your family wound up in this?
Most of my ancestors died before I was born, so I only have secondhand knowledge. But I believe that my great-grandfather, I think, bought the land, which is now known as the Point Farm and is now still being used. And he really was mostly a dairy farmer.
Your grandfather was primarily a dairy farmer with the
Yes.
Point Farm.
Yes.
Okay. And
And I know he came here in the early 1800s, and before he had married, he and his brothers had gone to California in the gold rush. And then they came back and settled down, got married, and he had children. He had 5 daughters before he had his first son.
interesting. So, and the family did the family remain in this area? Were they pretty much concentrated in the park area here?
Pretty much
Valley
stayed
area,
in
I should say.
Everett. 2 of the girls married local boys, and They at one time had a store and an inn, and they sold produce and supplies and horses to the canal people.
Now, was the valley area around Everett, was it pretty much exclusively farms? Were there a lot of farming families?
Originally, I think there were quite a few farms, but as time went on, there were a lot of people that came down just to live out in the small town.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about how you recall, as a child, living on the farm, a day, say, in spring versus summer versus fall, with respect to the work that had to be done and the day's activities and your mom and your dad and brother and things you would be involved in.
Our land only was around 35 acres, so we really weren't big farmers, but we always had things that we had to plan for, and I think I'm just very happy that I was able to live in a small place. And in the spring, very early, my dad would order seeds from Burpee's seed catalog, and he ordered by the pound, not by the packet. And then he would have to start preparing the fields. Spring was the time when the wildflowers came out, and that was the most beautiful time of the year. And in the summer, of course, there would be preparing other things to do. We'd have to hoe, we'd have to plant, we'd have to pick, we had to can, but it was all fun.
And it sounds like it was mostly a manual operation.
At that time it was.
Mm-hmm.
My dad only had a team of horses, and everything else was done by hand. We hoed by hand, we picked by hand, we packed by hand. And I think the industrial age changed when tractors and other implements came into being, then it made it a lot easier. Mm-hmm. But that was later.
Did your immediate family manage this all by themselves, or would you have to have help come?
We did it all ourselves.
The harvest and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like a lot of work.
It was. We didn't think it was work. We just thought it was fun.
Tell us a little bit more about growing up. I know you, in your book here, mentioned your school experience in Everett and also here in Peninsula, and some of the things you did with friends and so forth growing up here in the local community.
That's a lot of questions. School was fun. I had taught myself to read before I went to school, and we went to a one-room school, and by that I mean there were 8 grades and 1 teacher in one small room. We didn't have electricity, we didn't have running water, we had an outdoor privy, but it was great. And I had the extra special thing of having the teachers board with us. My mother didn't want boarders, but somehow she got stuck. And we had the 1st grade teacher lived with us, the 3rd grade teacher was my cousin, and she lived with us, and my 4th grade teacher lived with us too. So at home I would call them by their first names, and they were my friends and my cousins, but at school they were Miss So-and-so. But we had a great time.
And then you went through 8 grades in the one-room schoolhouse?
I went through 4 grades.
Oh, 4.
And then they closed this one-room school, and we, from then on, went on the school bus to Peninsula. They changed the name of the Peninsula School to Boston Township School, and we went there from 5th grade through high school.
And speaking of schoolhouses, and it's kind of changing the subject, but as you mentioned, the barn that your dad built, I think started out that way. Could you tell us about that?
The barn has an interesting story, and it's a little confusing to most people. It originally was a one-room school in Botham, Ohio, about 6 miles to the south of our property. My dad bought it for $110. He paid cash, like he paid for everything. And he took it apart. I shouldn't say he did, we did. We all did. We pulled nails, we took things apart, and we packaged them up, took them little by little down to the farm, and it was rebuilt. So the one-room school became our barn.
And in addition to the crops that you grew, you also had animals on the farm?
My dad had a team of horses, Kit and Dick. Then he acquired a cow. Her name was Betty, and she gave us calves, and usually 2 at a time. And we had a lot of chickens, and we had a lot of pigs, and that was about it for animals.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we always had a dog.
So, how long did you live on the farm? And
I lived in Everett from the time I was born, and I was born in the bedroom. When I say I was born there, I wasn't born anyplace else, and I left in 1942 when I married my husband. We moved to Cleveland.
Mm-hmm. And how long did your parents remain with their property on the farm?
My mother became ill as she got older, and they decided to move to Cuyahoga Falls. I think this was around 1960 or so. But they kept the farm, and my dad still farmed. He commuted from Cuyahoga Falls. And it was only because her health failed her that they left. But the farm stayed in their family, and then my mother eventually died in 1969. And my dad, in the meantime, had moved back to the farm, and he died in 1976. But it really had stayed in the family. And then when he died, it was left to my brother and me.
Mm-hmm. And all the while, your dad maintained and continued
Yes, he
to
did.
operate the farm?
Yes, he did.
How was that from your perspective as far as business-wise? Did it provide income for the family or sufficient? Did your dad have to do other things or?
My parents were not greedy people. They shared everything with everybody. And my dad's idea of farming, mostly, especially when he got older, was to share with everybody. He was happy if he could sell enough as he got older to pay for his seeds and his fertilizer. When during the Depression years, we did make some money, but we ate very, very well.
Mm-hmm. I think you mentioned in one of your stories in the book that your dad went to work for a paper mill that started up in the valley here.
He worked for a time at Jate Paper Mill, and then later he worked as a foreman for WPA. He helped finalize the road on Riverview Road. Then his last job was with Summit County Engineers, and he drove heavy equipment in the winter for snow plowing, and he drove other equipment in the summer. He loved to be outdoors, and he loved to farm. He loved to see crops grow.
You and your brother inherited the farm upon your dad's death. What happened after that?
For a few years, we used to go out and cut the grass and make it look good, but we knew that we didn't really need the farm anymore. My brother had his own property, we had our own property, and so did my grandchildren and grandchildren and my children. So we decided to approach the national park and tell them it was available if they wanted it.
Mm-hmm. Did they, and it was you approaching them, they didn't?
I approached them because I knew it was in the future that was going to happen anyway. And it was a shame to leave the whole place vacant.
Mm-hmm. And right now, I understand that your home is part of a visitor center?
Yes, it is. And I'm happy to go visiting.
Is it the original structure? Did they kind of
They just reconstructed and did some extra work on it. Probably cost them a lot of money because the house actually was vacant for over 15 years.
And what about the property surrounding it? Is it being farmed at all now, or?
I'm sorry to say that when they had the flood in 1975, I believe, it ruined some of our fields. They have now become almost a forest. And so it's not being used as a farm, but it is a good location for a visitor center because it's right on the towpath.
I see. Which would imply that your farm was close to the canal as well.
It was our border.
Uh-huh.
We just paralleled the canal.
Now, one of the brochures you showed me was the law that enabled the canal back in 1825, I think it was.
That's correct.
Now, do you have any recollection of the canal operations from your childhood? I don't know the history of the canal, so maybe you can help us there.
The canal was completely dry. It was just a ditch, a big, deep ditch. But I can remember my parents referring to the towpath, and the towpath became a place where my dad had a hotbed, and it's where the pigs were, and also the chickens.
So the actual canal area or space was pretty much abandoned.
It was
you were
abandoned.
Growing up, and so it was just
It was full of trees and weeds, and everything just grew there wildly.
Mhm. Has it refilled since? Because I always hear of floods related to the canal, or is that in a different area?
It's not really much noticed right in the area where I grew.
Tell us a little bit about the Point Farm, which was also part of your extended family, or you had relatives that owned that?
At the time when I was growing up, Nathaniel Point Jr. and his family lived there. So I sort of grew up with them because this farm was only about less than a mile away, and we could walk there, and we visited there an awful lot. And this would have been my mother's Uncle Nate. And they farmed, but my Uncle Nate, I'm sorry to say, was more of a musician than he was a farmer. And he wasn't a very good farmer, and they didn't grow very many things.
You had mentioned that it was around the corner or up the street. You had an opportunity.
It was on
to visit quite often.
Akron Peninsula Road,
Mhm.
but it was nearby.
As a youngster, you had mentioned in your stories especially that you'd get together with cousins, neighbors, and things like that. Tell us some of the things you did for fun and recreation growing up here in the valley.
I think farming was like recreation to me, but we did a lot of things. We were always busy. We played in the winter card games and board games and ping pong. In the summer, we were mostly outdoors. We swam a lot in the creek. We called it crick. And we played ball. We had a lot of neighbors for friends. We had family reunions. It was just endless what we were able to do. We used our imaginations more than children do today.
After you were married and you moved up into Cleveland and lived in the suburbs, did you continue to come back and
Oh, absolutely.
help out and work on the farm and all?
Nothing could keep me away. We used to come out almost every Sunday, and we traveled back and forth. I kept in touch with my mother, and because it was a family kind of line on the telephone, we didn't talk about anything personal, so we used to write letters in between, and we really enjoyed coming out. And I have two sons, and they both enjoyed going out to Grandma and Grandpa's.
Mhm. And I think you mentioned to me already that your one son is pretty actively involved still in the whole farming industry, if you will.
Absolutely. He
Tell
lives
us a
in
little
Medina County, and he's very active in the Medina County Fair Board. And at the present time, he's raising miniature horses and pedigreed rabbits. He has a barn full of hundreds of pedigreed rabbits. And he really has good memories, and we go down to visit the farm quite often.
Now, where is he far away or nearby? Or?
He lives in Medina County in Valley City. It's probably about 25 miles from my house.
Is there anything unique about the valley here and where he resides as far as farming opportunities are concerned? I mean, is there better terrain or anything like that?
Medina County, of course, is different than Summit County, and it's a different terrain, but I think Medina County at one time had a lot of farmers and a lot of farms, and just like every place else, these farms are dwindling.
Mm-hmm. Does your son grow crops as well, or is he?
Not at the present time.
Okay.
My son is now retired.
Mm-hmm. And focused on the horses and the rabbits. You showed me a photo of your dad when he first got his tractor, which was probably a pretty big event.
I think he was very excited. He had always owned a car. We always had a car from every time I can remember, so we were able to communicate. We really lived in a very, very small town, but we always went to Akron, we always went to Cleveland, and so we weren't really novices with the city life.
And when he got the tractor, did that change the whole routine a lot?
I think it made it a lot easier. You don't have to clean up after tractors.
You had mentioned upon harvesting that you'd spend several days and perhaps weeks canning fruits and vegetables with your mom. Was that exclusively for your family, or was it enough to sustain your family and sell as well?
My mother was a perfectionist. She had just miracles in her hands. She played classical piano, and she knitted and crocheted, and when she canned, it was perfection. All the peaches had to be lined up, and it was really beautiful. And she also showed at the Summit County Fair and won blue ribbons. I loved to pare apples and peaches and pears, loved to help grind things, and we just had a really wonderful time. It wasn't work, it was just fun.
Mm-hmm. Did they inform you or give you any idea of what their intentions were, or were they just kind of buying land wherever they could?
I think at the time that they purchased the farm, they really didn't know what they were going to do with it. They just knew it was in a strategic place. Being right on the towpath, there aren't many houses on that side of the towpath where it would be easy for walkers to stop or the bikers to stop. But that's what I'm saying. It was vacant for so long that the house had somewhat deteriorated. But we were very pleased to know that it would be a visitor center and that we could visit too.
Perfect way to maintain everything and visit home every so often, right? And you visit up to the present, is that correct?
Pardon me?
You visit currently even.
I visit often.
You could probably be a guide for the Park Service. Are there any other stories that you'd like to relate with respect to your experiences in the valley growing up or even afterwards?
I have so many stories, it would take forever to tell them. But I'm just grateful that I lived in a small town, and it really gave me a good basic background for what I ended up doing. I still meet with several of my friends for lunch once a month. We visit and recall old times, and that's a great pleasure. It's been so wonderful to live for 9 decades.
Your parents' farm. Could you just give us a sense of what the farm actually looked like? The fields, the farmhouse. What did it look like?
What does the farm look like?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't look like it did when I grew up there.
Well, what did it look like when you were growing up there?
Well, our house really was sort of unique. It wasn't really a very nice house, but it was a wonderful home, and there's a difference. And we had a living room, a dining room, a kitchen, and 2 bedrooms on the first floor, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. You'll notice I didn't say anything about bathrooms. We didn't have one, but we did bathe. Mm-hmm. And we had a cistern, and we had a well also. We had a huge yard, and at one time we had planted 4,000 evergreen plants, and we sold Christmas trees for a while. We used to have many, many strawberries, raspberries. So fortunately, I think we ate better than anybody else I know. And my mother was an excellent cook and an excellent baker. So people that think a big house is everything, it really isn't.
Did you have a favorite place on your farm growing up?
Absolutely. I had what I called my secret little wildflower place, and we had every kind of wildflower in the book. And this was where in the spring I would go down, and there were all kinds of things, just trilliums, and we had 4 different kinds of violets. There were purple and dark purple and light purple, yellow and white. And I used to just get down on my knees, and I'd just pick these flowers like crazy, and we used to have big bouquets, and I'd take them to my mom so excited that I'd picked all these flowers for her. It wasn't just one little dandelion, it was all these other things that we had in the woods, and this is a special, special place. And I'm afraid perhaps the flood that they had from the fact that the covered bridge went down probably eradicated many of these flowers.
And you said that your family grew vegetables. What types of vegetables did you grow?
Almost everything that you can think of, but my dad particularly liked to plant sweet corn, and we planted in series so that it would last almost all summer. And then we had wonderful cantaloupes, and we had yellow and red watermelon, and we sold these so cheaply it was really funny. And we'd have people from the city that would come out, and we would plug the watermelons to make sure they were ripe. And I can remember once when I was probably about 10 years old, a family stopped and they wanted watermelon, and I plugged it for them, and I said, this is really good. And well, we never heard of a yellow watermelon. Well, this is a yellow watermelon, and it's ripe. He said, "You're such a sweet little girl, I couldn't believe you."
And what made the yellow watermelons different?
Yellow watermelon, the skin is the same, but you go inside and the flesh is yellow, and it's very sweet. It's similar to eating honey.
So what was the process for selling the vegetables? What did you have to do to prepare for that?
We had just a little makeshift stand out in the front under a tree, and it was just strictly a couple tables and things. It wasn't anything fancy, and we were only open on weekends. But we had a sign out on our tree that people could stop if they wanted other vegetables. But we sold predominantly sweet corn, cantaloupe, watermelon, tomatoes, peppers, beans, and a few other things, but those were the ones we sold the most of.
And what was it like interacting with those customers?
Fun. Just fun. It was a great experience. We had a cigar box that held our change, and we knew the prices. And this was back when I was only maybe 10 or 11, and my brother was 5 years younger. And he helped some too. But I enjoyed meeting all these people. And we always gave more if they had, this was Depression years, and if they had children, we gave them extras, more than what they paid for.
And so what was a typical day for your mother? What kind of role did she have growing up?
What kind of role did my mother have?
Yeah, I mean, why if your father, was out in the field farming, what was your mother doing?
My mother, and I'm included in this, we mostly worked indoors, although all of us planted and hoed and picked. But we were the ones who took care of the house and canned and prepared meals.
Now, you mentioned the schoolhouse. I would love to know more about what both the outside and the inside of that schoolhouse looked like.
I have pictures of it. It's a little hard to explain. The building itself was quite plain, and as I said before, it was one room. We had some hooks in the front for our coats and a place of a shelf to put our lunch pails. In one corner was a bucket of water, and everybody was supposed to drink from a dipper. And the first day I went to school, I didn't like that, so I told my mother that everybody was supposed to drink out of one dipper, and she said, well, that wasn't good. So we found a container that had a spigot and was covered, and we could put the water in there, and everybody was supposed to bring their own cup. In the front was a blackboard in a flag, our United States flag. In one little corner we had a few books that was supposed to be our library, and we had chairs and desks that were in rows. The smaller desks were to the one side, and they kept getting a little bit bigger for the 8th graders because there were children there from approximately 5 and 6 year olds up to probably 14. And outside we had a privy, and today we have so many sanitary things. Back then we didn't have any place to wash our hands, but we survived and we kept well. It was a great experience. Typical day at school, the teacher would come out to the front and ring her bell, and we would start having classes, and she'd have 1st grade reading, and then she'd have 2nd grade something else, and 3rd grade something else, and 4th grade math, and keep going up the line, and we had classes all day, and we'd go up to a recitation bench, and but we learned how to read, we learned how to multiply, we learned how to divide, and we thought maybe we didn't know as much as we should, but when we went to Peninsula we kept up with them. And even in high school we did, and when we went on to school I found that the other kids didn't know more than we did anyway.
Kind of the historic Everett, what was Everett like, before before now?
I think Everett at the present time has practically vanished. They try to call it Cuyahoga Falls, but I prefer Everett. I think originally it was called something else, and they renamed it back in the early 1800s to name it after a man that had been quite popular there. I think at the time that I lived in Everett, there were probably just a little over 100 residents. But before that, in the canal days, it was quite a thriving little small place because it was a place where the people would stop and get extra supplies, including horses. And my grandfather was involved with an inn and supplies and horses to the canal people. Over the years, it has just deteriorated. At one time, it was a ghost town, but now they're trying to revive it a little bit.
There was also a railway stop.
We had our own depot. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
And what kind of buildings were there? What kind of stores?
Everett consisted of about a dozen or so houses, a depot. There was a weigh station where people would go to weigh their milk cans and their milk. We had one small store that was also a post office, and you could also buy kerosene for your lamps there. There was another store about 1,000 feet away that people could buy groceries. And we had a church. It was the only church in town. It was a Protestant church, and if you were Catholic, you had to go to Peninsula. And we had our one-room school up until 1931, and that was our town. Fortunately, my father always had a car, and when we really, really wanted to replenish our supplies, we usually went to Cuyahoga Falls or Akron. At that time, in the early days, there weren't very many good roads, so that was kind of a problem. But we always managed to get our supplies that we needed. But we used to go to the little store over at the corner of Everett Road and Riverview. We went daily to get our mail. And they had wonderful, wonderful penny candy there. That was the most popular thing that they had. Their canned goods and their staples were quite expensive, so we really traveled to get those. Because of its location, the church was rather a central place to have every event, and we used to have box socials and potluck dinners and plays and different things over there. Things changed after I left because by that time there was, of course, electricity and people were more able to get around better. But we used to do a lot at the church. It was sort of our hub. People were pretty much friendly and did things together. We used to get together for card games. There used to be dances, but we were so close to Peninsula that we did a lot of things there. My dad belonged to the American Legion, and we went to American Legion meetings, and we belonged to Grange. But I think the most exciting things were the dances that were in Richfield and in Peninsula. That was where I met my husband.
Tell us about those dances.
Oh, the dances were fun. In Peninsula, it was at the GAR Hall, and my dad used to sell the tickets, and my mom used to sell the soft drinks. And we used to do foxtrots and waltzes and two-steps and square dances, and we'd have cakewalks, and the cakewalks, you walked around to the time of the music, and if you stopped at a certain spot afterwards, you got this cake to take home.
Where were the dances held, and in what buildings?
That was in the GAR Hall at the corner of 303 and Riverview in Peninsula.
Are there some kind of legendary stories that you all love to share?
Oh, we have a lot of funny little stories. We used to have a man that lived over at the corner of Riverview and Everett that made pretty little rings out of pigtails. And we were asked to bring over a pigtail if we had a butchering at our house, and then he would take these little bones out of the pigtail and make little rings, and the original ring was like just from the pig, but he would make little hearts and little squares and little diamonds and put on top, and almost every little girl in Everett had a pig's tail ring. Well, before we had our own Christmas trees to use, my dad would take me in his car, and we'd go up on Oak Hill, and we'd go through this big field of thousands of Christmas trees, and he let me pick out the tree that would be our family tree. So this was really special, and I was very picky, but we always had a pretty tree. We didn't really celebrate with a lot of gifts, but we always had some special gift. And one year, I got a little sewing machine. Another year, it was a gramophone, and we had records, and it played Bye Bye Blackbird, and I think I played this so many times I wore the record practically out. We didn't really celebrate birthdays only with a birthday cake. It wasn't a lot of gifts and big parties like they have today. But we always had a Christmas tree, and before we had electricity, we had candles, and candles were put on these little tin holders. And if we lit the candles, we had to stand right by the tree because it would be very easy to have a bad fire. And we always had a special dinner, and my mom used to make a special pudding, Dayton nut pudding with real whipped cream. And so it was special. We shared it sometimes with other friends and other relatives, but I just enjoyed Christmas especially.